Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Social Contract Theorists, edited by Christopher Morris. This is a collection of essays about three major social contract theorists, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And the book's organized so that all the essays about Hobbes are in the beginning, the middle are the essays about Locke, and the last are the essays about Rousseau. I've talked about all three of these figures in previous episodes, and I want to focus today on one of them, one of the essays. This essay is called Hobbes's War of All Against All. And there was an essay about Locke that was very interesting, Locke's State of Nature, by A. John Simmons, and then there was one about Rousseau that I also really liked. Rousseau's Sovereignty and Political Obligation by John Charvet. But I think I'm just going to focus on one of these. Maybe someday I'll come back and do episodes on the other two, the Locke essay and the Rousseau essay. But the one I found most compelling was this, actually the first essay in the book, by Gregory S. Kavka, called Hobbes's War of All Against All. This book was published in 1999. It's got a really 90s look to it, like purple and green. Funky looking graphic design. Kind of hard to read. The cover. It's got a kind of a 90s feel to it, which I thought was cool. But the essay that I'm going to read here, or read sections of, is from 1983. It was first published in the journal Ethics in 1983, and then reprinted in this collection of essays. And he talks about the idea that Hobbes put forward that the state of nature is essentially a war of all against all. If you haven't listened to my Hobbes episode, you might want to go back and listen to it before you listen to this one, because there's a few elements from that will be discussed here as well. In that episode, I talked about the sovereignty, absolute sovereignty, the possibility of absolute sovereignty. This author talks about that a little bit late in the essay. The size of the sovereign, the power of the sovereign, how much power the sovereign has, whether it's absolute power or whether it's all vested in the hands of one person or what. I'm going to skip over the end of the essay where it talks about that stuff because I've already addressed some of that. What I'm interested in is the notion that the state of nature is a war of all against all. Is that accurate? Is that an accurate assessment of the state of nature? And what are the implications of such an idea? Or if you were to just consider a scenario in which a war of all against all holds, you could then just call that state of nature, because the state of nature itself seems pretty up in the air as to what it actually even is. So if Hobbes proposes that as the state of nature, then so be it. That's what we'll consider it for purposes of this episode. But it is a question of whether that really holds, and what it means, and what the actual scenario is, and how much the state of nature applies. Like in the Locke episode, I talked about how John Locke proposed that the state of nature is always somewhere in the world. There are people existing in a state of nature. All it really is when there's no third party to act as a judge between two people if they meet in the frontier or in some unsupervised scenario. A state of nature exists between them. And Hobbes is sort of talking about a scenario where large groups of people are all in a state of nature. The war of all against all. This is a large, widespread state of nature amongst all people. So he's talking about a sort of a different thing as the state of nature, a different hypothetical. And what I like here is he talks about game theory a little bit in this. He talks about the prisoner's dilemma. I think the prisoner's dilemma has come up in some previous episodes. And He talks about it here, and he talks about how that applies to the concept of the war of all against all. And it's all very interesting. So, like all my episodes, I'll read a few sections. I have 6 here sections I'm going to read and provide a little bit of commentary about the particular sections that I'm reading. The first section I want to read is where he lists Hobbes' 5 assumptions that he makes that cause him to believe that the state of nature is a state of war of all against all. So he says, quote, "To prove the state of nature is a state of war, Hobbes begins with 5 assumptions. The last 2 are not stated explicitly in the presentation of the argument, but clearly are presupposed. 1. Natural equality. People are roughly equal in their mental and physical powers. 2 aspects of this equality are of special importance. First, as relatively brittle organisms, each of us may be destroyed by practically any of the rest of us. The weaker among us are not so weak as to prevent their killing the very strongest using stealth or weight of numbers. Second, the differences in people's natural powers are not so great as to make one an obvious loser to another should they come into conflict. 2. Conflicting desires. The desires of different people are frequently at odds. The supply of many commodities is not large enough to satisfy the desires of all who want them. Often 2 people will want to exclusively possess the same particular object, for example, a spouse or a parcel of land. Their objectives are bound to clash with those of the people they seek to dominate. 3. Forward lookers. People, if they are at least minimally rational, are concerned with their long-term well-being. They care about the satisfaction of their future as well as present desires, and strongly desire to prolong their lives. 4. Advantage of anticipation. In cases of conflict between persons, anticipation generally improves one's chances of success. Anticipation means either striking first or gathering power so that one will be in a stronger relative position when the battle eventually erupts. Since the primary means of gathering power that Hobbes discusses is conquering others so as to put their power at your disposal, it is clear that anticipation generally involves the use or threat of force. 5. Limited altruism. Individuals value their own survival and well-being much more highly than the survival and well-being of others, and act accordingly. Hence, if a person believes a certain course of action best promotes his own security, he is very likely to undertake it, even if it jeopardizes the survival or well-being of others. From these 5 quite reasonable and realistic assumptions about human beings, Hobbes constructs an elegant and insightful argument for the state of nature being a state of war. Imagine people in a state of nature, in which there is no common power over them to punish them for robbing, assaulting, and killing one another. As forward-looking creatures vulnerable to death at the hands of virtually any of their fellows, they will rightly be concerned about their future security. Lacking a system of law enforcement, they cannot expect potential attackers to be effectively deterred by fear of counter-violence. For due to the rough equality of people's natural powers and the advantages of striking first, potential attackers will realize that they have a good chance of success. Nor can one expect potential attackers, whose altruism is at most limited, to refrain from attack out of concern for their potential victims. Thus, each person in the state of nature must fear violence by others, who may attack for any of 3 reasons. First, glory seekers may attack simply because they enjoy conquest. Second, competitors may attack to remove one as an obstacle to the satisfaction of their desires. Third, and most important, even moderate people who have no desire for power or glory for its own sake, and who may have no specific quarrels with one, may, for defensive purposes, engage in anticipatory violence against one. That is, they may attack to remove one as a potential future threat to themselves, or to conquer one, to use one's power, to deter and defend against future attacks by others. In these circumstances, eventual involvement in violent conflict is not unlikely. And since anticipation generally improves one's chances of success, it is the most reasonable course of action for rational persons, caring about their future well-being and caring much less, if at all, about the well-being of others to follow. End quote. So he breaks down 5 assumptions. Natural equality, which is, obviously, we're not exactly equal, and I've talked about that plenty in previous episodes, but the point being that when you consider weapons and when you consider stealth, it's not unreasonable to consider that most any averagely fit, capable, intellectually capable person could, if he wanted to, sneak attack someone else without them knowing and kill them. If you were to consider a world in which there are no consequences from authorities, it's not unreasonable to think that just about anybody could kill just about anybody else if they wanted to, unless they had created, some specific mechanisms of defense that other people are also capable of creating. So the next of the assumptions was conflicting desires. So this is obvious. People want the same thing, and they can't both have it. There's limited resources in the world. People want what other people have, and if they think they can get it without consequence, many of them will take it. People can't all get their needs met at all times. And inevitably, circumstances will arise where people will engage in conflict over their conflicting desires. One thing that's interesting is that Hobbes is proposing aspects of human nature. Partly these are things about the world, like we live in a world of limited resources, right? That's not really anything to do with humans. It's just the way it is. There's just not enough stuff for everybody. I mean, I guess the assumption is that people have unlimited desires. But even with presumably like rational, reasonable, not excessive desires for the things that one needs in life or one wants in life on account of one's, instinctual drives, sexual access to foods, access to resources, access to shelter, access to protective measures, whatever it may be. It's just part of nature itself that we live in a world of potential conflicting interests. But it does presume that humans have interests, and that people are willing to engage in certain activities like conflict with one another, like violence or fraud or whatever the means may be, in order to acquire the things that other people have. It is a statement about human nature. He's not obviously using any sort of real powerful scientific verification for these statements that he makes. They're sort of assumptions. He calls them the 5 assumptions. But back in this era, which is the 17th century, it was pretty reasonable to just put forward a statement and say, I propose that human nature is as follows, and not necessarily need to have empirical evidence to back it up. But I think that a lot of our studies and stuff have backed up a lot of this. Point 3 is forward lookers. Essentially, we're planners. We're thinking about the future. We're anticipating the future. We're considering what might happen, what opportunities or threats might arise. Number 4 is advantage of anticipation. In cases of conflict, anticipation improves one's chance of success. There's a first mover advantage. If you catch your enemy unawares before they catch you unawares, you want to strike first. There's an advantage to that. The advantage of anticipation. The advantage of being able to anticipate accurately what your opponent has access to and what their course of action might be. Anticipating them and striking before they strike is important, and it provides an improvement in one's chance of success. Number 5 is limited altruism. Individuals value their own survival and well-being more highly than the survival and well-being of others. This is a basic fact of human nature, but unfortunately too often contested, I think. And obviously there are certain exceptions with loved ones, and people do have a sort of general sense of sympathy and altruism and concern for others. It's not that they don't care about other people at all. It's that at the end of the day, they care more about themselves than others. And that's just human nature. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way people are. So that's his fifth assumption about human nature. And he does talk about how, a little bit after that, he talks about the anticipation, the power of anticipation, and that people might attack because they enjoy conquest. They might attack to remove obstacles. They might attack for defensive purposes, and an anticipatory attack because they fear that someone else may try to attack them, and why wouldn't they? And so these are the basic facts about why the state of nature is a state of war of all against all. So then, a little bit later, he brings in the prisoner's dilemma. And I think that's really interesting. He says, quote, "Prisoner's dilemma consists of two players, each choosing independently and without knowledge of what the other player is doing, between a cooperative and a non-cooperative move. The payoffs to each player are determined by the combination of their moves, and are such that each player orders the four possible outcomes from most preferred to least preferred as follows. 1. Unilateral non-cooperation. 2. Mutual cooperation. 3. Mutual non-cooperation. And 4. Unilateral cooperation." Prisoner's dilemma constitutes a dilemma in the following sense. Non-cooperation seems to be the rational move for each player, for it is a dominant move. That is, whatever move the other player makes, one fares better if one does not cooperate than one would have fared if one had cooperated. This is because unilateral non-cooperation is preferred to mutual cooperation, and mutual non-cooperation is preferred to unilateral cooperation. Yes, oddly, if both players make the rational move, they both fare less well than they would if they had both played the irrational cooperative move. What this seems to show is that in some situations there is a genuine divergence between individually rational behavior and collectively rational behavior, and that methods for achieving coordination of parties' behavior in such situations can provide real benefits to all. For present purposes, however, all that we need to assume is that non-cooperation is the rational, because dominant move, for an individual to make in a single play of Prisoner's Dilemma. Suppose now that we iterate Prisoner's Dilemma by supposing the parties know that they will be playing the same game against each other n times in succession. How would this influence the rational strategy of the game? Intuitively, it seems to open up the possibility of cooperative moves being rational. For in the iterated game, one has the opportunity to influence one's opponent's moves on later plays by one's moves in earlier plays. Thus, suppose you think playing a cooperative move on a given play will make it more likely your opponent will cooperate on later plays. Or to put it somewhat differently, suppose you believe your opponent may punish a non-cooperative move on your part by later not cooperating when he otherwise would have cooperated. Then it may be rational for you to make a cooperative move, even though it is dominated on the play in question. And it seems that cooperation can make later cooperation by your opponent more probable, by posing an invitation to future cooperation, or by accepting such an invitation that he has offered by cooperating on earlier plays. And in fact, when iterated Prisoner Dilemma is actually played in experiments, many pairs of players achieve a rewarding pattern of mutual cooperation on most plays. Nevertheless, there is a powerful argument designed to show that sufficiently rational and knowledgeable players will make non-cooperative moves on every play. The argument begins with the assumption that we have a game of iterated Prisoner's Dilemma of some definite number of moves, n, to be played by two players who are rational and interested solely in maximizing their personal payoffs, and will remain so throughout the game. It is further assumed that this is all common knowledge among the players. That is, each knows it, knows the other knows it, knows the other knows he knows it, and so on. Given the assumptions of self-interest and rationality, and the dominance of non-cooperation in a single play, it follows that a player will cooperate on a given play only if he believes so doing may induce his opponent to cooperate on some later play or plays. Since each party, being rational, knows this, each party knows his opponent will not cooperate on the nth, i.e. the last play. For there are no later plays in which cooperation by one's opponent could be induced by a cooperative move on the nth play. But then, each party knows that a cooperative move on the n minus first play could not induce future cooperation by his opponent. And being rational, he will not cooperate on the n minus first play. But his opponent, knowing this, will have no reason to cooperate on the n minus second play, and will not so cooperate. Thus, by similar reasoning, we work our way back step by step, or by mathematical induction, to the very first play and conclude that each party will make the non-cooperative move on every play. End quote. Okay, so he's talking about the prisoner's dilemma, and he gets into it. It's hard probably to visualize exactly what he's talking about, but if you understand the prisoner's dilemma, then you know what he's talking about. He's basically saying if you are only playing one game of prisoner's dilemma, you're not going to cooperate, meaning cooperate with your partner, who's the other prisoner. You know, that's who you're cooperating. It's not about cooperating with the police. It's about cooperating with your partner. If you both cooperate with one another, the other prisoner, then, right, you get out, neither one rats the other one out, you both get out, good for you. That's the ideal scenario. And yet, if you look at one play, it's always better to not cooperate in that play, because the person who rats the other person out gets a benefit, but only if the other person, you know, tries to cooperate and you backstab him. It's always better to backstab in a single play, because you don't know that your partner is going to cooperate with you. Right? If your opponent's going to backstab you, then you can't cooperate. Because if you're cooperating, like you're keeping your mouth shut, and your opponent is not cooperating, aka they're stabbing you in the back, they're ratting you out. And you're keeping your mouth shut because you're cooperating with your fellow prisoner. And so the circumstances for you are bad in that circumstance if you cooperate. So if your opponent is going to stab you in the back, you have to also stab him in the back to avoid that scenario. But if your opponent is going to cooperate with you, it still remains better for you to stab him in the back, because that's better for you. Now, the point here is that it's always, in any given circumstance, better to backstab, better to not cooperate. But your opponent knows that. So they're always going to make the same move. They're always going to backstab. You're always going to backstab. They're always going to backstab, because both of you know that it's always better to backstab. So then you both stab each other in the back every time, which is not the ideal outcome for the two of you. It would have been better to have cooperated and not stabbed each other in the back. You would have gotten a good benefit. So the point here is that as long as you're acting in your own interest, you're not achieving the optimal collective outcome. Both you and your opponent are stabbing each other in the back all the time. And you're not gaining the benefit of cooperation. Right? It doesn't have to be a people stabbing each other in the back and going to prison. It's the question of cooperation versus non-cooperation. When a single person gains more for himself by not cooperating because of the risk of being betrayed and because of the opportunity of the benefit of betraying others, the reward for that, people are not going to cooperate with one another. And yet, the group as a whole is consistently held back, and all of its members are consistently held back by the perpetual backstabbing and the perpetual non-cooperation of its members. To gain a better advantage for the group, better benefits for all members of the group, cooperation has to occur. And then the question becomes, what prompts that cooperation? So here he begins to talk more about like bringing this into the political realm. So what's interesting is this has come up in books about evolution. So it comes into evolutionary theory, but it also comes into political theory and cultural evolution, like the creation of the nation state and things like that. So he says, quote, "The argument that rational players will never cooperate in bounded, iterated, multi-party prisoner's dilemma can be applied to try to show that mutual aid pacts will never be kept by rational parties in the state of nature. Briefly stated, the argument as applied to aid pacts goes as follows. Suppose that we have a number of people who make a mutual aid pact in the state of nature that calls on each to come to the aid of any of their number that are attacked. Each party is rational and purely self-interested and will remain so as long as he lives and the pact is in effect. The parties will, between them, suffer at most a definite number of attacks, n, with the actual number determined by the propensities of external attackers and not in any way by their own behavior. We suppose that coming to another's aid is dangerous, and that therefore each party will keep his promise to aid an attacked member only if he expects that this will make it more likely than if he did not offer aid that the present victim and or other members will aid him if and when he is the victim of future attacks. Finally, we assume that all of this is common knowledge among the pact members. Given these assumptions, it follows that each knows that if an nth attack occurs, the partners of the victim will not come to his aid, there being, by hypothesis, no future occasions on which they might be victims, and thus benefit from the aid of others. But since each knows that the others will not help him if he is the victim of the nth attack, each will have no reason to offer aid on the n minus first attack, if there is one. For the only possible reasons for a self-interested party helping, to decrease the number of future attacks or to encourage reciprocal help later, has been ruled out. Each party will thus realize that none will help another on either the n minus first or the nth attack, if there are such attacks. But this removes all possible reasons for any to help others on the n minus second attack should it occur. By similar reasoning, we work our way back to the n minus third, n minus fourth, and eventually the first attack, concluding that no party in the pact has any reason to help the victim of the first or any subsequent attack, and that each knows that no other member will ever help him if he is attacked. The conclusion of the argument, the hopelessness of aid pacts in the state of nature, is counterintuitive, even paradoxical. It seems that truly rational parties so situated would at least try aiding their fellows a few times in hopes of creating a practice of beneficial reciprocal aid. Nevertheless, I am inclined to think that the argument, or some more precisely stated variant of it, is valid. The implausible conclusion derives not from fallacious reasoning, but from other sources, the argument's extremely strong assumptions, and possibly deep problems with the concept of practical rationality as it is applied to situations in which agents reason reciprocally about one another's reasoning. In the present context, we need consider only the former source of implausibility. For the argument to go through, the parties must be assumed rational in a sense that guarantees they will replicate the line of reasoning contained in the argument itself. While the assumption may be only somewhat unrealistic, the assumption that each knows each of the others is thus rational, that each knows each of the others knows all are thus rational, and so on, is wildly implausible. Furthermore, the kind of knowledge of the circumstances and the other parties that is required for the argument to work is certain knowledge, that is, true beliefs, about whose truth the believers have not the slightest doubts. This is because the rational parties' chains of reasoning invoke a large number of relatively independent premises, and their degrees of belief in the conclusion of the argument at each stage will not, since they are rational, exceed their degrees of belief in the conjunction of the premises used up to that point. So, if their beginning degrees of belief in the premises about the risks of aiding others, the rationality of their partners, and so on, were significantly less than a certainty, they would not conclude that their partners surely will not cooperate, and they might rationally attempt cooperation on common sense grounds. In addition, the assumption that the number of attacks by outsiders is independent of the behavior of the coalition members is almost certainly mistaken. The more the parties band together to successfully repel early attacks on members, the less likely they are to be attacked in the future, other things being equal. Common defense acts as a deterrent against potential aggressors. Since it is to the advantage of each partner to minimize the total number of attacks, as he may be among the victims, each thus has an additional self-interested reason for coming to the defense of the attacked coalition partners. End quote. So he kind of applies this this really specific prisoner's dilemma theory about the kind of backwards looking, but they have to. There's a presumption in there, I think, that a person knows what is going to be able to know when they hit. I mean, the whole thing rests on the decision they make in the nth round. So a person has to know they're in the nth round in order for that to apply. Like if two people sat down and they knew they were going to play 5 rounds, and then they think, how far into the game am I going to cooperate? Should I cooperate for 3 rounds and betray him on the 4th? Should I hold it all off and betray him on the 5th? But then he's going to betray me on the 4th. If they know they're playing for like 5 rounds, they can sit and work their way through and think, I can't trust him for any of these rounds because every round would be the round in which he would betray me, working backwards from 5. But when you don't know when the nth round is, this uncertainty that is invariably brought into the question when you try to begin to apply these things to real life, nobody really would or does operate quite in that manner. But it obviously, the less capable you think your ally is of providing you, or likely your ally is of providing you with assistance, the less likely you are to want to go out on a limb and provide assistance for them, at least in theory. But of course, the theories always need to correspond with observed reality, and that's really the premise of empiricism, right? He talks a little bit more here about the state of international affairs and about the concept of anticipation, the anticipation of what the competitor is going to do, which is the anticipation is the thing that drives the whole n-1, n-2 phenomena, is the anticipation of what your opponent's going to do. So he says, quote, Hobbes claims that the logic of anticipation applies among groups as well as individuals in the state of nature. Thus, if persons were joined together in families or other small groups, the destructive war of all individuals against all others will simply be replaced by a war of all groups against all others that has similar disastrous consequences. According to Hobbes, the only viable solution to the insecurity generated by this war of all groups is the formation of a commonwealth, a political entity, governed by a sovereign with undivided and unlimited powers. To evaluate this new variation on the war of all argument, we must examine the reasons Hobbes offers in Chapter 17 of Leviathan for supposing that no social arrangement, short of a commonwealth, as he defines it, can provide its members with sufficient security to eliminate the need to anticipate. In doing so, it is important to keep separate arguments related to 2 distinct properties of groups, their size, and the concentration of power within them. For as we shall see, some of Hobbes' most plausible remarks concern group size, and have only an indirect bearing on his conclusions about the desirability of the concentration of power. Consider first the question of size. Hobbes observes that security rests on deterrence, which, in turn, rests on one's group being large enough so that potential attackers cannot be reasonably sure of victory. Contending that a relatively small advantage in numbers is a reliable sign of victory in conflicts between small groups, he concludes that small groups cannot deter attack and provide their members with security. But will this not depend on the empirical details of the case, in particular on whether there are larger groups in the vicinity? Might not small, but nearly equal-sized groups provide sufficient security for their various members in state-of-nature situations? Perhaps, but Hobbes could plausibly argue that for reasons of both defense and conquest, people in such circumstances would have strong incentives to increase the size of their groups, for example, by merging one group with another. Hence, an equilibrium among small groups in the state of nature would be highly unstable and would not provide protection for long. End quote. So he basically says that the same things that apply to individuals apply to small groups, and it kind of seems like, right, there's limitations to how much this really applies, because small groups can provide some degree of security, but how much, when their opponents are also organized into small groups and there's motivation for them to expand, so they remain in a state of war of all against all. They remain in a state of conflict, and they remain in a state of anticipation of future conflicts and first mover advantages, and they still remain in a state of war of all against all. That's just all the groups against all the groups. And it seems like some sort of accumulation of power, larger groups gaining advantage over smaller groups. There would be a sort of race to larger, stronger, more powerful groups. So he begins to talk a little bit about this expanding groups, expanding and combining with other groups to larger and larger entities. He says, quote, "Why should those in the state of nature not opt for a grouping of all persons worldwide, or at least try and form a group containing the majority of mankind? Why would they settle for a group smaller than this, when doing so would provide others with the incentive and opportunity to form a larger group and defeat them? There are two sorts of reasons. First, for large groups, being the largest is not always necessary for deterrence and defense. So many variables interact to determine victory in conflicts among large groups that even a substantial advantage in numbers cannot begin to assure one group victory over another. Also, some geographical barriers, for example oceans, mountains, will reliably deter a large group from attacking smaller ones. Second, there are disadvantages associated with increasing group size. It is difficult to coordinate the actions of large numbers of people spread over large distances. The larger the group, the greater the potential for internal conflict, as there is likely to be greater variation in beliefs and values among the members, and less group cohesion based on personal attachments. Given these and other inefficiencies of scale, coupled with the fact that deterrence capabilities are not primarily a function of size for large groups, the larger the group, the greater the potential for internal conflict, as there is likely to be greater variation in beliefs and values among the members, and less group cohesion based on personal attachments. Given these and other inefficiencies of scale, coupled with the fact that deterrence capabilities are not primarily a function of size for large groups, we would not expect rational inhabitants of the state of nature to seek to increase the size of their groups without limit. Rather than the grand or majority coalition of all mankind forming, we would expect rational parties to gather into large groups with the exact sizes varying in accordance with the particular circumstances. Suppose the parties in the state of nature coalesced into a number of large groups for security reasons. Would the state of war argument not apply to the relations among these groups as it does to individuals and small groups? Hobbes allowed that it would, claiming that the nations of the world are in a constant state of war of each against the others. But the consequences of war, in Hobbes' sense, among nations are not so bleak as those of war between individuals and small groups. For even while known to be willing to fight each other, nations are able to uphold the industry of their subjects. The import of this cryptic remark may charitably be interpreted as follows. Nations are large enough and orderly enough to secure a man's life and property against those he is likely to come into direct contact with, and to provide him with enough reliable partners to make his productive activities worthwhile. Further, the state of war between his nation and others constitutes a much smaller threat to his life than would a war of all individuals or small groups. For because of the problems of organizing large groups for combat, the uncertainty of the outcome in battles between states, the geographical barriers between states, and the relatively small number of agents on the international scene, actual fighting between states is relatively infrequent, and directly involves only a small segment of a warring nation's population when it does occur. Hence there is much less fighting and killing per capita in the war of all nations than there would be in a war of all individuals or small groups." End quote. So in a sense, you see, like, the state of nature, there's not ever a real escape from the state of nature. It's just that the frontier of the state of nature is pushed out as groups form larger and larger. So the borders between one group and another group is really where the state of war exists. And the state of war remains eternal, but it becomes much less violent and much less likely to break out into war, because as these groups get larger, the challenges involved in making war, the potential consequences of losing a war, become so great, and the benefit of trying to conquer other nations becomes not all that great. That at a certain size, the state of war just sort of settles into a low-scale, ongoing, periodically breaking out into strife, but no major, not as many deaths as would occur if the state of war was literally every person against every other person. So that's interesting. Moving on along this line, he says, quote, "The argument that nations can provide their inhabitants with a tolerable degree of security depends to a considerable extent on the likelihood and the effects of war being constrained by a. the difficulties of mobilizing and of overcoming geographical barriers, and b. the fact that there are only a small number of international agents whose calculations or miscalculations could produce large-scale fighting. This becomes apparent when one imagines an international situation in which these constraints are not present. Consider what is, unfortunately, a possible state of the real world 80 years from now. 100 or so nations are armed with nuclear weapons and long-range missiles or bombers. Enormous destructive power is thus continually mobilized, relatively unconstrained by distance and geographical barriers, and may be set loose by any of 100 or so government heads or cabinets or military councils. These nations, like the individuals in Hobbes' state of nature, are competing for scarce natural resources and for international reputation. Given their unclear arsenals, they are equals in the sense Hobbes stresses. Each can kill any other, unilaterally or with the help of confederates. The uncertainty of victory, in the modern form of likelihood of mutual annihilation, would constitute an enormously powerful constraint on any nation attacking another under these circumstances. But with the other aforementioned constraints absent, a citizen of this multi-nuclear world might rightly feel far from secure. Given the grave conflicts of interest between nations, the apparent advantages of striking first in a nuclear conflict, and the large number of actors whose miscalculations could produce an attack, sensible individuals and governments would greatly fear the occurrence of a nuclear attack that could set off a spiral of international nuclear violence. Two plausible strategies for dealing with the dangers of this sort of international situation are suggested by our earlier discussion of Hobbes' war of all argument. Nations might pursue the defensive coalition strategy by forming alliances, thus attempting to convince even the most irrational adversaries that attack would surely be suicidal, and at the same time reducing the number of independent actors who could start a nuclear war. Or they might follow the strategy of forming a sovereign world government." End quote. So he really kind of brings this to a point where, okay, now imagine that we've got these large groups of people in a sort of stalemate with one another, but as they acquire the nuclear weapons, things change. The state changes to more closely resemble the individual all against all, to more closely resemble that state where any nation, if it wants to, could utilize first strike advantage, especially with dirty bombs and terrorist attacks and everything else. The various types of attacks that are possible, the various mechanisms for delivering a nuclear bomb, almost transforms the world into a dangerous state like the war of all against all once again. And potentials are essentially, seems to be two giant coalitions, like the U.S., the First World and the Second World, the U.S. and its allies, the Soviet Union and its allies, or into a global world government. This was written in 1983 during the Cold War. A bunch of nations, each individually armed with nuclear weapons, flying by the seat of their pants, probably seems like what this author would least prefer. Perhaps something in between the world full of rogue nations and the two-poled cold conflict. It seems like a sort of the multipolar world, maybe like 6 large-scale geographic, civilizationally connected regions of the planet in a state of balance of power. So rather than giving it to 2 entities or 100, you coalesce around 10 or less. The multipolar world. That seems like a vision that makes sense. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.